Hello, and welcome to the Microlearning over student-directed video projects. You may be watching this video because you're interested in starting your own video project with your students. You may be here because you have a current video project that is just not delivering the results you want. Or you may just want to learn a little bit more about cinematography. All wants are valid and will hopefully be satisfied in this microlearning. First, let's discuss why this microlearning is needed. I have a video project in almost every single class I teach, and in the early days, my students' projects were not that great. Many were out of focus, blurry, hard to watch, or just flat out boring. I struggled to teach mastery of the basic concepts and film theories to my students, and they in turn struggled to apply them in any sort of effective manner. This all changed when I started to put more of the learning and exploration on my students. Instead of lecturing about angles, frames, and focus, I started giving my students guidelines and just setting them loose to explore and learn on their own. Next, let's discuss what you're going to be able to do after this microlearning. Number 1. I want you to have a basic knowledge of terms and theories that are utilized in the professional world of film. Number 2, I want you to be able to coach yourself and your students through optimizing a camera phone for quality video recording. And number 3, I want you to be able to implement some camera activities with students at the center. So on to some vocabulary. There are 5 main words I want you to be comfortable using with your students. These terms will help you establish a common language with which to teach, coach, and critique your students' projects. Subject. A person, thing, or location that is the focus of the shot. It's what you're trying to film. Focus. The part of the picture that is not blurry. What you want the audience to see. Location. The particular place of a scene. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Shot. A film sequence photographed continuously by one camera. Normally, in any sort of film or video, we take these shots and edit them together to make the one complete project. And then the last vocabulary term is frame, the edges of the image. These are all going to come up later in the microlearning. I also recommend that you include these terms in any sort of rubric that you use to grade your students' efforts with. Now, let's talk about a couple of theories behind the camera. First theory. The rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is really simple. Imagine your frame is divided into 9 parts by 2 lines running horizontal and 2 lines running vertically. Kind of looks like tic-tac-toe. Your subject should be placed at the intersection of any of these 4 lines. It's a simple and easy way to clarify what the audience should look at within the frame. Breaking this rule should be on purpose and in order to have some sort of effect on the audience in some way. Second theory, balance or unbalance. Take any picture and fold it in either half horizontally or vertically. If the 2 sides match, then you have balance, or what some people refer to as symmetry. Human beings love symmetry. It pleases our brains. We naturally seek it out in either beauty or comfort. While unbalance or asymmetry can tend to make us wary of someone or something. Use the facts to affect your audience perspective of characters or settings. Last theory, avoid eye-level shooting. Okay, take your frame and place the very center at the eyes of your subject. This is what we call eye-level shooting. Avoid this. It can seem dull and mundane. Instead, change the composition or angle of your shot to create dynamic feelings or convey thoughts or ideas to your audience. When could you use eye-level shooting? Well, when you want something to seem mundane or everyday. Okay, you may be thinking, hey, this is supposed to be student-centered? Why am I learning this? And you're right, this is student-centered. But you're gonna have to teach a little, coach a little, and grade a lot for any type of video project, whether this is for a history class, a theater class, or a math class. And having these basics under your belt goes a long way to enriching your students' learning. Please don't feel like you need to be an expert on any of this. Quite frankly, when I started out, I wasn't, and I currently don't consider myself an expert. It's only through similar trainings like this and my own research and play that I've learned any of this information and created some pretty darn good projects. Alright, part 2, optimizing your phone for video. Okay, so a huge factor in my projects is the prevalence of camera phones in the classroom. Instead of continuously banishing these devices to the shadow realms, as some teachers like to do, I work really hard to embrace them and utilize them most every class day. This approach takes a lot of relationship building and reinforcement between the teacher and students. But it pays off once the students realize they can have access to their phones as long as they're using them for school activities. Now, it's not 100% effective, but it can be highly motivating and great for classroom culture. With that in mind, I encourage my students to use their phones for this project. Now, you should be aware that not all of your students will have phones, which is totally okay, and you should have a backup plan in case that happens, or just flat out pick groups with at least 1 or 2 phone-wielding youths in each group. Now, using a phone for a video project is different than using it in your everyday life, and there are some settings and hoopla that one should go through in order to get the most out of their device. Number 1, make sure the phone you use has plenty of battery and is free of cracks. Cracks in the glass of the screen can impede your ability to estimate the quality of each shot, and no one wants their camera to die in the middle of filming. Next, in your general settings, turn the brightness all the way up, airplane or do not disturb mode on, and low power mode on. This will ensure that your battery lasts, your ability to check shots is maximized, and you can avoid interruptions during filming. Side note, make sure to turn low power mode off when you're exporting or uploading the file for editing, as this mode will slow down the process to a crawl in order to save power. Some camera settings. In the general settings of your device, there will be a section for specific settings for your camera application. Make sure your camera is set to 1080p HD at 30 frames per second. This will enable you to have high quality footage, but keep your file size to a manageable level. Also, turn off HDR. This mode messes with some image quality. It's not super important, but it does really help. Also, turn on grid. Grid will help you follow the rule of thirds by providing a grid that can be seen while you're filming but does not appear in the video itself. Also, quick tip, click to preserve settings to keep from having to update this every single time you want to start filming. Here are a few additional tips when actually filming with a camera phone. Make sure to close out all background apps. This will help you to preserve power and bandwidth. Also, film your phone sideways, okay? Vertical filming, holding it like you would text, does not look good and is not really compatible with most displays. Make sure you film with your phone sideways. Avoid moving the camera during filming. Moving the camera can look quick or jerky, and it makes the quality of your image and the things that you have captured less. So, make sure your stuff is high quality by keeping that camera still and only moving when it's really purposeful and making that movement slow and smooth. Last tip, add a beat before and a beat after each shot of just kind of silence and nothingness, even if that's just your actors like standing in place. This is going to really help when you're trying to edit things down and gives you some wiggle room, okay, for establishing shots and things like that. Okay, on to part 3. The actual student-centered exercises. Now, these are supplementary exercises to use with any of your video projects. They are not mandatory. They do not have to be done, but they can really help improve your students' use of phones and camera work, okay? The first is what I call the famous film recreation, and here's how it works. Students group up and pick out 3 or more famous images from movies. They then set about recreating them using set props, costumes, and characters they have on hand. The focus is getting as close to the same composition of the famous picture as they can. That means they want similar angles, shots, distances, and heights of all the pieces and people involved. If they can even get the lighting similar, that's a bonus. The second activity is an exploration or scavenger hunt of different types of professional shots. This is really great, and it was kind of like an ingenious moment. Literally one day, my students showed up and I just handed them a list of shots with descriptions and then tasked them with taking pictures of every single one on the list. It's simple, straightforward, but avoids a day of lecture and notes. Instead of students learning vocabulary through me just talking at them, they instead learn by experimentation and trial and error. I also highly recommend a digital platform for both activities that can hold all the pictures you students take. It is educational and fun to have everyone look at everyone else's work throughout the process, and also holds them accountable for actually producing things of quality that the whole class will view. Highly recommend it, just part of the end of the class day, sitting down and everyone watching. On the famous film recreation, it's really fun for all of your students to kind of compare and see who got really close. It can be great for establishing the inner working and group dynamics of your new PBL. Last thing, I promise. Some tips to help you maximize the potential of any video project. All right, tip number 1. Make sure this project fits your students. Not every class and not every student, not every school is going to respond the same way to a video project. Make sure that your students have the resources necessary to enable to do this. If your school doesn't have a bunch of video cameras or your students don't have access to cell phones, don't do this project. Instead, find a grant that will help you do this project later. Don't try to force, round pegs into square holes. All right. Also, second tip, understand some basic editing software. Even if it's just like iMovie Maker or something like that, it will really help the tail end when your students start editing everything together. Most editing software is so easy and simple to use and pick up that I wouldn't really stress about it, but me teaching you how to edit would be a whole other microlearning. Tip number 3, do this late in your class timeline. So in a year-long class, I usually put this about the middle of the spring semester, and in a semester-long class, this is 3/4 of the way through. The reason is I need to build a culture with my students that can handle this type of project. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with a video project, and the later this is, the better, okay? Also, hey, this should not be your first project, whether it's in the beginning or the end of the year. Okay, you really want your students to understand how project-based learning works and how student-based learning works. All right, you really need to develop those sort of like guidelines and rules with them first before you put phones in their hands and just say, hey, go. Speaking of which, next tip, actively monitor your students. And what I mean by that is not just like sit at your desk and look up every once in a while. I mean literally walk around constantly. On days where we were videoing, I put in about 10,000 steps, okay? And that's because my students needed to know that any second I could turn the corner and be there, okay? This is going to make sure that they respect the time, they respect each other, and they respect the process. Also, next tip, make sure you give your students enough time to make a quality project. I would say about a week and a half from planning to practice to implementing to editing. 2 weeks if you really want to be comfortable. Any more and any less, and you're really going to dip in quality and motivation from your students. Next tip, you really need to create a culture that can share resources. So the biggest resource, obviously, is space. And I highly recommend you figure out some good spaces for your students to spread out and be able to film where they're not talking over each other or getting each other's shots. But what I also mean is that there are going to be locations and even items that students are really going to want to use. And you need them to be able to say, okay, we're going to give you guys 5 minutes right next to this door, and then we need to use that, okay? And that does take a little bit of time and some flat out you telling them you guys need to share and be nice to each other. I also highly recommend you have checkpoints for your students, just points in the process where, hey, you need to turn in the script. Hey, you need to show me at least 5 shots. Hey, you need to have your stuff finished by this time. And hey, you need to turn in your fully edited video. This is going to keep your students up to date, and it's also going to make that one group who's not maybe the most motivated continuously working and having places where they need to check in with you. Also encourage students to plan their process and scheduling. Your best videos, hands down, are going to be from the people who understand how to plan and produce something. It always amazes me which groups kind of fall through and which groups rise to the occasion, because those that rise to the occasion are the ones that are like, okay, we're going to be at your house on this day, we're going to do this at this school, make sure you bring this for Tuesday because we're all going to film that part. It really does take way more planning than your students are used to, and encourage that. Maybe even have some like handouts or worksheets that build that into the process. Last tip. Know how you want your students to submit their work, okay? What do I mean by this? Either have a place like Google Classroom or Dropbox, or even just like an email account where they will send you their finished stuff. Or tell them like, hey, I want everything to come to me in a flash drive. This is going to make things more consistent, and also is going to make sure that students aren't garbling video files. All right, guys. That's it for the microlearning. All right. I hope you had a really good time. And make sure we continue a culture of play.